Mr. Harris here, and welcome to a new video. In this video, we're going to introduce what are fossil fuels and learn the three different sources or types of fossil fuels. So first off, in Hong Kong, we are getting energy from various types of sources. Like as we know, electricity, we can get it from either nuclear power or even we've learned about solar power, so on and so forth, or wind power. But primarily, we are getting it through the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal and natural gas. And of course, there are also, you've heard of these terms like town gas, LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, oil that contains petrol and diesel. But where are these actually coming from? They're actually all coming, nearly all of them are coming from fossil fuels. So, what exactly are fossil fuels? So, first, fossil fuels, I would like you to highlight this. It's the remain of dead organisms that lived millions of years ago. So right now you can imagine the coal or the petroleum that we have, they're actually the dead organisms. The remains, like you can think about the fossils or like they're just leftover sort of material that gets left behind. Coal, so there's three types. Remember I mentioned there are three sources. The first one is coal here. It's from dead plants. And primarily we use coal as fuel in power stations. And we have two other types, which are petroleum here. Petroleum, we mainly use it for fuels like petrols, kerosene, or to produce plastics. And I would like you to notice here, we get petroleum and natural gas, we get them from dead sea organisms or marine organisms. So coal comes from plants, petroleum and natural gas, it comes from the sea organisms. And as I mentioned, petroleum, mainly we're using it as fuels like kerosene or petrol or heavy oil. You'll learn all of them later, or even to produce plastics. For that's for petroleum. And natural gas, on the other hand, it's not the natural gas that maybe some of you are thinking about, not that type of natural gas, but mainly we use this for fuel for domestic cooking. Fuel for domestic cooking. All right. And here you could see that there's one sort of, you could say, drawback or disadvantage about fossil fuels, and it's being covered up, so I'll rub this part out. They will eventually run out, and they are limited, in other words, because they're non-renewable. So they will run out and are non-renewable because they're limited here. I'll write that word for you, limited. That's why we need to figure out some ways to find some alternative energy sources. Like I mentioned earlier, we've heard of solar energy, wind energy, hydroelectric energy, tidal energy. So all of these sort of different sort of powers or energy that you've learned. But primarily here, fossil fuels, I wanted to introduce there are three types or three sources. And first type is coal. It comes from dead plants. Second type, petroleum and natural gas. They come from dead organisms. So how exactly does it work? So let's imagine you have coal here, and we learned that coal comes from dead plants. So imagine that millions and billions of years ago, there were giant plants or plants that died in ancient swamps. And over millions of years, the dead plants were buried under the water and dirt. So they will obviously sink to the bottom here. And then due to these three factors, okay, pressure, heat, and bacteria action. So three here. One, pressure, high pressure, high heat, and bacteria action. So eventually it's you can just imagine with this process taking millions and millions of years with high pressure, high heat, and bacteria action, eventually the dead plants would turn into coal. And that's why you can find coal at the end or at the bottom of the sea. And petroleum natural gas sort of the similar way. Instead of dead plants now, you're thinking about marine or sea organisms. They would sink to the seabed, they would sink to the bottom. And eventually, over time, the remains or you can imagine the fossils were covered by layers of sand and sediment. And again, the three factors, high pressure, lots of heat, and oh, I should write number two here, and bacterial action, it would turn the remains into petroleum and natural gas. So that's why when they're asking you the definition of fossil fuels, so usually in the past papers you'll see that, or sometimes in the exams you might see what exactly are fossil fuels, then it's usually a 2-mark question. I'll write for you. The first mark would be given that it's the remains of dead organisms. It could be either plants or animals. That's the first mark. We'll write 1 mark here. And where's the other mark? It's obviously here, that lived millions of years ago. That's 1 mark. And if they ask you how is coal, how is petroleum, or how is natural gas formed, then you will mention these three factors. Due to high pressure, due to heat, and bacterial action, eventually it will turn the dead plants into coal and the dead sea organisms into petroleum and natural gas. So that's exactly how fossil fuels are formed.